this, you know? Okay, I'm going to start now. I'm talking to Kelsey. Okay, so question about paper. Any other questions, practical stuff?
Are you going to send us the citation stuff? Because you're going to send us
It's due Friday.
Oh,
For Chicago.
Yeah.
it's the link to the style link? That's
Whatever-
correct?
Yeah, you said you were going to send
Okay.
us a link and something. I want to make sure we do it correctly.
Okay. That's right, Chicago. You can just search Chicago manual. I'm not saying that to make you feel bad because a lot of weird stuff does come up. I don't think there's any fake websites like this is. So it's the Chicago Style Citation Quick Guide. And to get the whole thing, you have to pay money.
Oh.
I'm not doing that,
Is
of
it in our
course.
handbook, though?
It's in the, it's in the Little Seagull handbook. It's just easier.
For some
That's
text,
what Brian was using.
use E-Terabian, which is very helpful. All you need to do is plug in the ISBN number, and then it'll spit it out for you.
Don't do that. That's
But-
terrible.
Oh.
But for anthologies and things like this, it won't work. So it's helpful for like,
Tony.
You even mentioned that.
This is starting the symposium. We try to teach students to not use one of those sites that just does it for you.
And it's only using
Oh my gosh, there's courses for the fall up here now. All right, I'm sending you an email right now just so I don't forget. Okay?
Are you very strict on the 4 pages?
Yeah.
That is 4 to full pages, right?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I don't know.
So,
So 3.5.
It's not for.
wait, it's double spaced, right?
Yep.
Even if we're single spaced like this.
Even if we're just like, and by we, I mean me, I just blather on.
If you are unsure how to if you're unsure how to proceed, come and talk to me. And if I'm not available, then I'll make the time. Like I can come on campus tomorrow night. A couple of minutes. Just because I have to go home and make dinner and stuff like that. Sorry, this is actually running. I'm so sorry, Kelsey. She's like, this is exciting. I'm learning so much about theology. We'll see, won't we? That's why I have to leave. 'Cause I don't know. Okay, any other questions about the paper?
This is probably in the syllabus. I just haven't looked. How much are the essays worth?
I have no idea. It's on the syllabus. I just don't remember. Okay. What'd you say? 50%? Yeah, whatever Patrick says, let it be done. Okay. So a lot of my undergraduate education was very great book style. Like my first year was just, all I did was this one great books program, and we read complete text, never selections. Like it was very strict in that way, sort of Chicago style, not the different, like Chicago great books. And sometimes I get a little frustrated with the choices that other people make about excerpts from things, but it's just a necessity to sort of practically move through something quickly. But every now and then I just feel like I'm getting confused, and I think if I'm getting confused, maybe they're confused. I don't really know. And though historical generalizations are as misleading as they are truth-bearing, I just want you to, instead of asking you to get your syllabus out, and then which you might not have with you, I just kind of printed out a bunch of names that are on the syllabus, just to give you a sense of where we're going, okay? And we'll just look really, really briefly, because I know 2 people are going to speak. Oh, I have another one here, brilliantly today. It'll make sense what's going on here, God willing. We are going to look very briefly at, wait a minute. We talked about Lessing last time, correct?
yeah.
Started Lessing. So we're just going to talk a little bit, just a couple of points about Lessing and Kant on Scripture. Then who's introducing Schleiermacher? I just like that name. So you're going to introduce Schleiermacher and tell us what you need to everything we need to know about Schleiermacher. Then we'll do Kierkegaard and maybe talk more about the text of Kierkegaard. A little bit easier to make sense of. Okay. So the reason I gave this, does everyone have a copy of this? Kind of, sort of. So all I wanted to communicate to you in terms of what we're doing, because some things are going to go in a different way after the break, okay? I mean, as you remember, this course, of course, began with the major Reformation figures. And I know that at some points we might have liked to slow down a bit and think about the hot theological topics a little more. Calvin on predestination, Luther on justification. And even though inevitably we had to sort of touch on these things and move out of them, in a way that was kind of a deliberate choice on my part, because you look at Luther and justification. Here we've got this joint declaration that basically says Catholics, Lutherans don't really disagree. Calvin, 98% of what Calvin says about predestination, Thomas says. But the interesting question about, the stuff that's really interesting about Calvin, though, is the more general picture of how he sees God in relationship to the world, or what he does with the idea of predestination. So where, like, Thomas Aquinas, for example, says, yeah, God's will is God's will, and we're just going to stop talking about it. Calvin talks about it quite a bit. And he wants this to inspire hope. So it has implications for spirituality as well as this sort of general sense of how God is related to the world through power. Okay, but in a way I wanted you to leave a little bit theologically dissatisfied that first part of the course, because I think it's honest to say that the Reformation is first about politics, second about theology. And that's not just politics in the usual sense, it's also the politics of the church and how the church is developing in time, okay? It's about power and authority and big issues like that. Important issues that the church is not quite ready to deal with, but perhaps through no fault of his own, perhaps through its fault. Whatever, we're not interested in blame. Catholic response we handled super inadequately, but that's the nature of things. But I tried to point to some of the awesomeness of the Council of Trent, the issues, and the way that Ignatius and Teresa, in their different ways, try to put contemplation and the active life back together, which is really the great ideal of the medieval spiritual age. Not some people go off to a cave in the desert, and some people, the Franciscans, can go and serve the poor. They're really trying to bring the missionary teaching spirit of the church back together with a strong sense of obedience and fidelity and defense of the church. But, by the time we sort of move into the 17th century, the reality is just, this is what the introduction, what I tried to emphasize last time, everyone now lives in a pluralistic Europe. You add to that and these new worlds, new populations being discovered all over the world. In a way, there's more focus on spreading the gospel, which is great, and a kind of exhaustion theologically at home after decades of war and fighting and this and that. And so, as you probably got a sense of last time, all of a sudden we have many more widely, deeply educated people, not just a few theological voices. Okay, so we got, educated lay people, members of, German Reformed, Dutch Reformed, all different churches, okay? And so just so you understand what we're doing in these couple of classes, and this is a very typical way to divide, that's so lovely, I'm sorry, I'll leave it there so you resent me silently for the rest of the class, okay? And this is a very common simplification, is that we have, and we were reading this last time and the time before, we have the rise of Enlightenment rationalism, right? And there's the typical names associated with that. And then the reaction of Romanticism. Now, Romanticism is a tricky word. It means different things in different disciplines, but you kind of get the idea. You go too far in one direction, you have a reaction. And then I mentioned after some of these themes there, that we'll see some evidence of Catholic rationalism in the 19th century. We have a reaction to Romanticism, and then there's a reaction, right? And that we could argue that scholastic Thomism in the 19th century is one form of that. And then we have a reaction against that. This is just how history works, back and forth, till the end of time, okay? So in starting with Descartes, Locke, and Kant, I sort of put down some themes there, but I just want to see if it makes sense to you what we mean by rationalism. Human reason. Is this bad? Is it bad to exert our reason to make sense of revelation, or to ask the question, what can we say about God on the basis of human reason alone?
I think it's a good thing, but you can only go so far with reason.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're focusing all on reason, you're not. I guess you could know God through that, but it's gonna be really, really hard.
Okay.
And
Yes.
there'll be holes that only God can show.
Right. And I like the holes thing, because that sort of, are you familiar with the phrase God in the gaps? That's one way of reconciling faith and reason, is to say, well, science is our way to know the world, but where there's gaps, like some intelligent design people propose this, when there's gaps in science's ability to explain things like biochemical versus just chemical, life or this or that, like that's what will sort of appeal to God, the stuff we can't explain, which has a problem. It's like God comes in when our knowledge fails. It makes God kind of dependent on our smarts. So and I think that's a good response in the sense that no, of course it's not a bad thing, but it has limits. That way of putting it does kind of sound like Thomas, though, doesn't it? And Augustine and Athanasius. So the question is really, when does reason go bad, or when does rationalism become a bad thing, so to speak, as opposed to a work that expresses the dignity of our likeness to God? Okay, so that's kind of the question we're thinking of. Okay. At the very least, reading Kant, I will not ever assign Kant again. Sorry. I'm really sorry about that reading. So he's just kind of a major drag. I'm figuring some things out with you as well. And a lot of what you see opening up in Kant, and in a way, this sort of taking up this question, is that, there's an interest in what we can determine about God by reason, and then call it whatever you want, faith, religion. Part of what is a new sort of aspect, characteristic, however much we have seen it coming, is how deep the divide is between these two. Okay? So that would be sort of point A about rationalism. The assumption that there is a sort of intellectual division, potentially an opposition. And the problem there, of course, is that it leads us in a way, I think in its most benign form, its happy form, to Locke, who says, look, what can we all agree on, right? The golden rule, monotheism, British law, this could be the basis for like civil society in a pluralistic age, okay? So Locke is like happy rationalism, right? Let's find the baseline that we can all agree on, even though we disagree on it so much. But what you're alluding to is, how do we put them together? And these are just unanswered questions. This sets up basically the entirety of the rest of the course after the break, okay? Romanticism reads, Kant and Descartes and says, oh, kill me now, it's so dry and boring. And not just that, I think Kierkegaard is the best example of this today. What do we do to God from a rationalist perspective? We can talk about that a little bit more. But the themes that arise in response to sort of this ideal of Cartesian rationalism, you can see here a much greater attention to feeling, and not just feeling like, I feel happy, but like feeling in the Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross sense, like, are you following Jesus? Like, Kierkegaard is pretty hardcore. He's awesome. Like, are you following him or not? Because if you do, he messes with everything. Okay, so there's this emphasis on, I wrote the word affectivity, the heart, but in a more sort of intellectual theological level, there's more attention to history, tradition, a certain view of history that maybe sees a kind, and we'll talk about this after the break, maybe God is evolving, revealing himself over time. And one of these introductions even suggests that some romantics go so far as to sound a little bit pantheistic, like we're losing the distinction between God and the self. Do you remember what pantheism means? All is divine. So sort of losing that sense of the clear distinction between creature and creation. Rationalists are all over this distinction. But they end up with a God, and we see this in the readings from last time, they end up with a God who looks an awful lot like themselves. Things are just being pulled apart. There's just, I just don't think there's any easy way to kind of summarize what the problem of rationalism is. Okay? In Fides et Ratio, John Paul II says that the flip side of rationalism is fideism. That is a commitment to faith as a sort of doctrinaire commitment that reason cannot touch. Okay, we're not yet at that. We're not in that land yet. Okay, but we'll start seeing it a little bit with pietism and the Great Awakening. So I just want you to get it. I just want to help you have a big picture sense of where we are. Okay. And just if you have this with, oh, no, Lessing, never mind. We'll deal with time another time. If you look at Lessing as an example of what's happening here, in terms of this attention to history and the idea that history, time has a sort of integrity and it's real. It means something. We're not just disembodied minds that like transcend our person and study the revelation or dogmatic truths that are timelessly one and the same. Okay. So just take a look, please. Page 279, really fast. Okay. Please, quickly. Remember, what's the big ditch? What is it? The broad, ugly ditch. I feel like we should make like T-shirts or something like broad, ugly ditch, or like a picture on it. Maybe not. Okay. Just let that one go.
It's a ditch between God and humanity.
Yes, and remember I asked you to sort of add into that God and humanity. What like the ditch is a ditch of space or time. Yeah, it's much more a ditch of time there, okay? So 279, halfway down the right-hand side. I'm not an Origen's position. I live in the 18th century. I live in Emmitsburg. Miracles don't happen anymore in Emmitsburg. I need the gospel to be preached. I need to have the faith presented to me in a way that's appropriate to a 21st century Emmitsburgian. 21st century Emmitsburgian. Is that a thing? Ugh. Sorry, just kidding. Yeah. So what's the historical problem? And you see Kierkegaard responding. This is why I want to start. You can see Kierkegaard responding to this directly. Why did the disciples, page 281 on the left-hand side, halfway down, that the Christ against whose resurrection I can raise no important historical objection declared himself to be the Son of God, that his disciples believed him to be such, this I believe from my heart, for these truths as truths of one and the same class follow quite naturally one on another. But to jump with that historical truth to a quite different class of truths and to demand of me that I should form all my metaphysical and moral ideas accordingly, to expect me to alter all my fundamental ideas of the nature of the Godhead, because I cannot set any credible testimony against the resurrection of Christ, then I do not know what Aristotle meant by this phrase, moving from one kind of truth to another kind of truth, so to speak. Okay, what's his problem with history? How do we know Jesus? I'm asking a lot of questions. I'm waiting for someone to answer one. Okay? Like, why did the disciples believe Jesus, the resurrection?
Faith.
Yeah, faith and... Sorry? Yeah, they saw him, they touched him. But at the same time, this is why, as you were leaving last time, I said, what were the miracles really for? Right? Thomas puts his fingers in the side and he says, for you, man. But blessed are those who believe without seeing and touching. So the idea that miracles are kind of evidence, visible evidence to convince, is an interesting problem developing here, okay? So he's saying, I believe Jesus is resurrected. Wait, did that not make any sense at all?
No, it does. Because
Okay.
miracles are for the faithful, to
Right.
confirm us in our faith.
Exactly. So they
If we
have
were
a
at Mass this
power.
morning, that's what the homily was.
Cool. Awesome. Yes. Yeah, and that's so. But the idea that you're like a Kant or a Lessing, and you're like, give me reasons, evidence to believe. That's not what miracles are for. Shazam! Now you all believe. Woohoo! Right? Like that's just defies sort of the nature of faith. Okay. But he says, I believe in my heart. But he's saying the kind of things that are part of the faith that we know from historical report are different kinds of truths from the truths that I believe in my heart. Maybe look at 280 on the left-hand side. A little more than halfway down. I do not know that anyone has ever asserted this. What is asserted is only that the reports which we have of those prophecies and miracles are as reliable as historical truths can ever be. And then it is added that historical truths cannot be demonstrated. Nevertheless, we must believe them as firmly as truths that have been demonstrated. So why are historical truths not demonstrable? Why can they not be demonstrated? How do we know historical truths? How do we know that Napoleon always stood like this with his hand in his jacket?
So we have a picture of them.
Exactly. So how do they know? Did any of them actually paint him in person? Napoleon. Yeah, some of them did. Okay, but one person could have made it up. So why do we know Jesus said this and that? Because there were witnesses, and those witnesses reported. They may be reliable, but they're not, we can't demonstrate sort of scientifically the truth of those statements. So in a way, he's saying history doesn't generate scientific truths. So the faith that I have in Jesus, in the resurrected Jesus, and my study of the Bible as a historical document, these are going to generate different kinds of truth. Do you see what I'm saying? So what we see happening here and in that little selection of Kant and the reader is they're starting to look at the Bible as a historical document and saying this is sort of feeding into the general skepticism that's part of Enlightenment rationalism. Does that make some sense? Okay, and you'd think if somebody showed up and to Lessing and said, "Hey, I'm Jesus," and did something miraculous, that might destroy this whole distinction. Right? If the resurrected Jesus appeared and said, "Here, Lessing," or "Put your finger on my side," then he'd have to. But I think he would then say, "That's just for me. It's not for anybody else." Are you guys okay? What's up? I know you don't want to look at this, but I know we're gonna. I gave you a really short selection of Kant on Scripture, where you see him doing something similar to something Schleiermacher is kind of going to do, and say the doctrine of the Trinity, taken literally, has no practical relevance whatsoever. Even if we think we understand it, it's irrelevant. Why? It transcends all of our concepts. Does the Trinity make sense? No, it's paradox, or what other words might be used to describe it. It's confusing. That's true. Okay. It's a mystery, right? And mystery assumes that there's maybe a greater intelligibility to come, but it doesn't change the fact that there's behind saying 1 equals 3 in the divine. You remember reading Boethius on the Trinity? You guys love that text. And Boethius said, when you take matter out of the equation, maybe we can reconcile this problem, but he just says, well, this is the best I can do, basically, to make sense of this intellectually. And it is a kind of mystery. Kant is basically saying mysteries are irrelevant to our life. They have no practical outcome whatsoever because it transcends our rational concepts. So Kant is more interested in the moral life, whereas it's hard to say what Lessing is interested in here. But you see, again, there's this bifurcation between what we can understand, what we can really capture with our reason, and what we can't. And, your use of the word mystery is, I think, sort of prophetic almost, Gabby, because in a way, when we try to get what's the difference between the distinction of faith and reason here and, say, with Thomas or John Paul II writing Fides et Ratio, somehow that idea of mystery is the key issue. Because for Kant, for Lessing, mystery is irrelevant to rational investigation. Whereas I think for Thomas, mystery is the heart of truth. Okay, I know that's very enigmatic and doesn't make anything clear, but we're going to talk about Schleiermacher and everything's going to become clear now. Who's speaking about Schleiermacher? You are? Sorry, I did remember. Okay, say hi, Kelsey. Sorry, I'm filming you, so you don't have to say hi.
Black screen.
Shoot, you go ahead. I just want to make sure that you're in sight.
So, Friedrich Schleiermacher, he was born in 1768, and his parents actually, it was interesting learning, his dad was a military chaplain, and his mom was also from, clergy family, so he had, religion emphasized from both sides, and, yeah, he was, part of that family, one sister and one brother. And he went to, or was a part of this school, the Moravian Brethren, and it was a pietistic group, and they emphasized the joy of salvation and vividly imaginative relationship with Jesus as the Savior. So you can kind of start seeing how, his big thing was, religion is, feeling and some kind of like abstract kind of thing like that. So like you can see like it had its like roots there. But he was kind of restless with this idea of religion, and so he continued to like study the like rationalist side and of like the Enlightenment. So he studied a lot of Kant's work, and he was kind of took a lot from that. And so in his career, he first was like a tutor, and then he kind of started his way into preaching. And he was very passionate about ethics and the human freedom. So he, started his work as pastor, and also started to write a fair amount. And he got connected with the Romantic movement, and he saw that the Romanticism is similar kind of to religion, because he said like there's feeling and intuition of the universe, and you can, in the sense of the infinite and the finite. So like the beauty of creation in the world. Being able to relate that somehow to a religion and faith. He also had this idea of like each person was a symbol of the infinite. So kind of like what Dr. Oakfield was saying was like how the God kind of becomes like similar to what they are, and kind of becomes reflective of like their own personal beliefs. But he like continued to work as a preacher and also a professor. And he continued to make this religion feeling movement, and that God lives and works in us. He was working at this university until Napoleon actually invaded, so it's funny that we referenced him already. So he had to go back to Berlin and was a pastor and professor there. His big work was on religion, speeches to its culture dispensers. And it was kind of bringing into conversation the Enlightenment and Romantics. He was definitely at that period where like the two of them were like going back and forth. And he actually studied a lot on languages and the origins of it, and how like translating that. Different translations have different meanings into what was being understood. And he emphasized the soul a lot. He also actually worked to unite Calvinists and Lutherans, which was cool to learn about, that he like wanted the two of them to come back together. He was disliked by the king, and there was an edict of banishment out for him. An interesting note about him was he was the best second-tier philosopher of his period, so not quite the top, but
the best of the second best.
So, he like definitely had his workings in like the Romantic period, and then also he was involved politically and with theology, so he kind of balanced all of those. That's about it.
Do you have any questions for Gavin? Okay, so you said this. You had this really interesting way of talking, or when you spoke of feeling as a vague thing. What's the primal feeling, or intuition is another word that I should have put up here. This intuition of the divine, which again there's a lot of continuity between intuition and the medieval mystics. The sense of the divine. So what's like the feeling, the primal feeling that is like the start of the heart of religion? Don't just see if you have it. I mean, you get a sense of this text. It is kind of a little bit rambly, these selections in a way. He's very, very elegant rhetorically, but ask, is there like particular text or language that you're interpreting that? Or you're exactly on the right track.
He talks about like the sacrament of confession, and I feel like that is more of like a acknowledgement of like subordination.
Okay. But where are you? Like, can you have a page number, a general area?
Page 360. Right-hand column, the first paragraph. I think he's talking about a voluntary confession.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what you're getting at. But he's also talking about
Certainly dissing academic theologians and philosophers there.
he's also talking about like the fall, I guess I want to say like the fall of humanity. And he talks about it on that same page at the bottom of it. He mentioned that you were familiar with the history of the human follies and have first different edifices of religion. So just sort of like talking about like how far we, I guess, we've strayed from
Yes.
the true meaning.
Yeah, and there's a lot of making fun of how theological. I mean, it's sort of part of his down with rationalists. Theological constructs actually push God farther and farther away. So I think, but when he says edifices, that implies a building that's made kind of artificially, meaningless fables, the most refined deism. Are you guys familiar with the word deism? Have you heard that before? I just want to be sure. I mean, it means just what it kind of sounds like, I guess. I mean, you're familiar with like theist. I guess someone has a conviction that there's a God, and a deist is just like a theist without any personality. It sounds like it should be a joke, right? I don't mean this individual, but it's a God without any personality, right? It's like more depersonalized. So we're not going to read this, but I mentioned there's like a resurgence of theological rationalism in the 19th century. And a classic example of that is William Paley, who makes the argument about the watchmaker God. The fact that nature works sort of implies that there's someone who winds the watch up, steps away. And then the deism there means, well, God is like a mechanical watchmaker or something like that. So sort of mechanistic approach to God. Anyway, he's basically just saying Kant and all these dudes give us this dry, boring, kind of clockmaker God. And basically just keeps on dissing people here. And I mean, 361 on the left-hand side, there's a lot of indignation there. Just read on there, 361 on the left. The despicable slavery of the scholastic metaphysical blah 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 coldness. Where it is present and effective, it must so reveal itself that it moves the mind in a peculiar manner, mingling or rather removing all functions of the human soul and resolving all activity in an astonishing intuition of being. So this is kind of what I took you to be getting at with the sort of lesser relation, but here he uses the language of intuition of the infinite.
It's like everything needs to be temporal or material. It's like going back to almost like a pagan understanding. Like the beauty of our religion is we can name God and we can behold Him as such.
Okay.
But this seems like so removed in like personality and more into just stuff and things.
Okay. And I think you're maybe getting a whiff of like that either pantheist
Yes.
or panentheistic element. Like you're just waiting for him to say the divine is everywhere, you just don't see it.
Right. Like
But
like rationalism, or romanticism is like hippies of the.
Okay, that's too mean. Okay.
Okay, sorry,
but
sorry.
no, but here's the thing: you have to see them. You have to imagine them reading Kant for 10 years and being like, "Oh, Harry."
Yeah.
Or else, like, I gotta
Yeah,
have some
yeah.
feeling here, people. If I have to talk about the categorical imperative another day, I am gonna
Well, there's
Yeah.
one thing to be like
just have a sense of the historical.
understanding God through nature, and then like wanting to feel nature and like being a part of it within.
I'm gonna go for some more walks. Let your hair down, man.
This is the vibe I'm getting from.
Okay, that's
sorry.
good. It's a vibe. Yes. No, it's a
Exactly.
vibe. No, I like that word vibe though, but I do want you to see. I mean, in a way, I think it becomes less weird sounding the readings we have after the break. In Christology, we talked about Wesley a bit, like this desire to actually get a sense of the Sacred Heart of Jesus after reading Kant for 10 years. It's like, yes, thank you. But I think the weirdness you're getting is this. It's intuitive. It's sort of all there. Wake up and feel it, people.
It's because we're essential beings, and that's how we come to know.
Yeah.
And I get that.
Yes.
Like this is important.
Okay.
Because that's how we intellect.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah.
But and so what he's trying to say is, okay, all this metaphysical stuff deals with immaterial. You know, or at least that's what it seems like to me.
Yeah.
Like.
And that's the only thing where I think it's a little bit unclear, because when he talks about, I mean, when you're reacting against something, you almost always embody a little bit of the thing you hate or that you're reacting against. I don't know if it's probably not universally true, but the way that he is talking about feeling your intuition it has a content, and many people sort of compare him to Wordsworth. So here's your homework for the break, Tony, is you're going to go for a walk. Are you going to be here over the break?
I'll be where I can walk.
Okay. You're going to spend a half an hour reading Wordsworth's nature poetry, okay, and go for a walk outside. You know, I mean that as a joke, so.
I just want to do it.
Yeah, but the word intuition implies immediacy, and that's what I take you to be sort of getting at with the sort of hippie illusion. Like, it's their people, but you with all your idols and your words about God and your constructs have just pushed the immediacy of God away. And even though it has a content, it is very much about feeling, okay? But why infinite? This is sort of getting back to what Patrick said, this sort of lesserness. I don't know if it's in this part of the reading, but the fundamental intuition is this feeling, or we could say this sense of dependency. Okay? So I don't think I wrote it down, that sort of pointless piece of paper I gave you, but for, attention to history, a personal experience. For Schleiermacher, the primal religious feeling is this feeling of total dependency. There's a real piety in that idea. Okay? But it's intuitive, it's immediate, and he's dissing people who are constructing these moral edifices, not because he's amoral, but because he thinks you're taming Jesus and making him a good moral teacher by doing that. And he's dissing sort of scholastic theology, and he has in mind Lutheran scholastics for preaching all about, you must learn the word and receive the pure word into your intellect through your hearing. And it's like, have you lost the cross? The guy that actually drove Luther mad with whatever. Okay, so that's just to help you make sense of the leaning on intuition and feeling. I think Kierkegaard helps us a lot more here, so I want to actually shift to Kierkegaard. Okay, whatever Kierkegaard was, that guy was not a hippie, unless Emily disagrees, in which case I would defer to her.
So Kierkegaard, his dates are 1813 through 1855, and he was a Danish philosopher and theologian. And his primary vocation was writing, and he actually chose that over marriage and was marginalized in his society because of that, and publicly shamed in the papers. So this could be reflected in his writings about the opinions of the masses, that personal experience. But what he did was he criticized Christendom and how the Christian faith was bound up with the state, and he also criticized Hegelianism and Romanticism. And Kierkegaard emphasized faith over reason, which is why he criticized Hegelianism, because Hegel said that the rational alone is Israel. And his writings had themes of suffering and the importance of the solitary individual before God, as well as the deception of the crowd and what it truly means to be Christian in a Christian world. So kind of making a critique of how the state was bound up with the faith. His view of the faith was influenced by his father, because his father had cursed God and believed that he cursed his whole family because of it. So that was like a big influence in his life. And he also grew up as a Lutheran pietist, and so they believed in like a strong emphasis on guilt and suffering and an enormous individual responsibility to choose the faith in order to be saved. So that caused a lot of anxiety in choice. And he also did not believe in any sort of mediation between yourself and God by a priest, but it was solely dependent upon one's own repetition of faith, like continually throughout their life. And he saw faith not about dogma, but about individual subjective passion. And he thought that dogma was offensive to human reason. And he thought that we cannot believe by virtue of reason, but we have to either have faith or take offense with his notion of the absurd. So if we have faith, it means that the idea itself must be absurd, because then why would you need to have faith in the first place, was his reasoning. And the impact that he had is that he's the father of existentialism. So he favored subjectivity over objectivity. And one quote that I think that reflects this is, objectivism is contradictory because it requires subjectivity to know what is outside itself, which objectivity must be. It's very complicated.
What does that mean?
So we need to have, we need subjectivity, was what he was saying, in order to have a relationship with God, because it's always in relation to yourself, and then going out from yourself. So that then affects us today, because I sort of saw it as the pathway leading to relativism, not like directly, but sort of like a step towards it, because he talks about subjectivity in terms of encountering the truth in a personal way, but at the same time he believes that it's less about what the truth is and more about how it's believed. So I think that there it kind of leads towards.
So if we get like that's where he's going on, like on page 373 and before that, after that, about that. Objectively, the emphasis, see the italics, is on what is said. Subjectively, it's on how it's said. Again, if you imagine him someone traumatized by recon for 10 years or something like that, what might that mean in a way that's not like radically subjectivist or relativist? Like what is the emphasis on how something is said? How could that, why is that important? What's he saying? In the mouth of this this or that person, something that is truth can become untruth. I mean, I just spent like 2 weeks reading the first 2 chapters of Genesis. There's with undergraduates at GR2, in today's world, there's very little the serpent says that is untrue. Very little to Eve. Okay, so just think about this. I'm provoking you, please think about this. Can't words that are true become a lie in the mouth of a liar? Someone who lies in their heart. Can't words that are false have a kind of truth to them when said in earnest? Who is it that some of you are sort of disturbed by? God who is and is not. Was that Meister Eckhart maybe, or Aristotle? He was getting at a mystical truth about the limits of language. How can we interpret this? It matters more how you say something. That might mean for Kierkegaard. But what's in the heart?
I'm only thinking about it in terms of his context. So, what had been going on in Europe around that time with a lot of different people saying different things, and maybe sort of what we've been talking about in terms of heresy, that there's always like a nugget of truth in it.
Yeah, I think like you alluded to sort of his frustration with the sort of boring official state religion, and I think he's really frustrated with respectable piety. It has no heart behind it whatsoever. How do we say something? Aren't words of love said with no love in the heart just worse than not saying anything at all? Because aren't they a lie?
What if they make somebody feel
Really?
like sad or something?
Okay.
If somebody like comes up to you and they're like, I'm so sad, and you just like stand there and don't say anything, that's worse than being like, oh no, don't be sad, even if you don't mean it.
Would you say, don't be sad, I really love you, even if you don't really love that person?
Well, I wouldn't tell them I love them if I don't love them.
Okay. That's good. But yeah, it's sort of empty, Jesus, lover of my soul, emotion. Sorry?
You were quoting Audrey Assad there. I didn't realize.
No. I just want to see if we have a sense of what he's getting at. Okay. All right, let's try it this way. The introduction said that he's, in a way, he's reacting against romanticism, and he is reacting against the weird sort of hippie vibe there. He wants God to be God. Okay. So leaving that aside, he's definitely part of this sort of romantic reaction against Enlightenment rationalism. On page 372, it says, when the question about truth is asked subjectively, the individual's relation is reflected upon subjectively on how of this relation. If the individual is in truth, so on and so forth. Okay. And then he goes on to say, God is a subject, so that's about 10 lines down, 372. God is a subject, and hence only for subjectivity and inwardness. Okay. Why say God is a subject? As opposed to what? Sorry? Okay, yeah. So why say God's a subject rather than an object? Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right, though. That's what this is. These red markers. Rationalism makes God into an idol, a concept, a word. And he's saying romanticism is trying to preserve a sense of God as a person or a subject. This is another interesting place where I'd say maybe not so much relativism, but you see Kierkegaard and existentialism pointing to what we know more familiarly as personalism. So you read Karl Voitila's The Acting Person, and there's a lot in there about refusing to call God an object. When Karl Voitila studied with Galileo College, the great fire-breathing Dominican in Rome, this is one of the things that apparently drove him mad, that Wojtyla, who would be John Paul II, refused to call God an object. That's because he was reflecting this tradition's anxiety about rationalism. Okay. So but what is he going to say there? God is a subject, and hence only for subjectivity and inwardness. What does that mean? That's got to be a harder one. Someone want to have a go at that? The existing person who chooses the subjective way instantly comprehends the whole dialectical difficulty. Comprehends this difficulty and all of its pain because he has to resort to God at that very moment. Because every moment in which he does not have God is wasted time. God is a subject and for subjectivity and inwardness.
Like, he is everything that is in himself.
In himself, who's the him?
Because he's the subject, he contains everything.
No, I mean, I think what he would worry about is that that sounds a little too pantheistic. God is everything is a dangerous statement, but somehow I think you're right that he wants to connect God as a subject to you and to me as subjects. Where does one subject meet another subject? Somehow interiorly. Within.
Like within our soul.
Yeah, within ourselves. Turn within yourself. It sounds a lot like stuff that we've read in the tradition, but that language of subject or subjectivity is new. And it's being proposed as a kind of alternative to making God into kind of an object or an argument. I want you to feel his angst, his anxiety, his pain, okay? It takes a long time, okay? Okay, are you with me? Heather, are you ready to feel a little anxiety? I want to see it written all over your face. I'm just kidding, I don't want to. Okay, I want to see it. But look at this, it's like 373 at the top, okay? You know, he says, when he talks about the distinction between good and evil is canceled, again, he's thinking about like Kant and people who want to make Jesus into a good moral teacher. And he's like, don't you feel that Jesus, right? Like, start with Jesus before you start talking about the category, moral imperative and duty obligation, this and that. He said, contradiction, forget it, okay? Thereby the infinite distinction between truth and falsehood only in subjectivity is their decision, whereas wanting to become objective is untruth. That's a really weird way of putting something, but it says the passion of the infinite, not its content, is the deciding factor. So it is subjective, it's about feeling, but it's this passion for the infinite. Okay, when Schleiermacher talked about the infinite, it was really hard to say what he meant by that. What does he mean by the infinite? Passion of the infinite. This is like the central thing for Kierkegaard. Passion of the infinite. So just
Is it because when we say infinite, we can think of like terms such as like time, and since God exists outside of time?
okay. Yeah, just keep thinking about that. No. But by contrast to like our experience, he keeps calling God the infinite, and I just want you guys to think about why he keep calling God that. And saying not only is God infinite, you have to have a passion for the infinite. So like the infinite for Schleiermacher was maybe a little bit more immanent, which means kind of present, and the sense of dependence. I think that what Kierkegaard, and I hate writing his name correctly, so I'm just going to write K, okay? Kierkegaard is similar to Schleiermacher, but not present. So the infinite, the sense of the infinite is the infinite distance, but I like how you appeal to time instead of space. That is just the infinite otherness. God is so radically different other than us, okay? Is the infinite distance or otherness of God. And he's saying when he talks about subjectivity, he's saying we have to have passion for this. Okay, what does that look like? Anyone trying to explain how you have passion for the radical unlikeness of God and creature?
We have to have passion from distance from God.
Simple.
Yeah.
The passion of the infinite, not its content, is the deciding factor. For its content is precisely itself.
Thank you for making it clear. That's how I know. It does sound, trying to sound like a sort of metaphysical rapture, or like it's smoking some really bad Danish tobacco or something. But what is somewhat clear from this text though is the passion is the key thing.
So is it like a yearning?
Sorry?
Like this yearning because
Yes.
God's so
Yeah.
far and I'm
Yeah.
not close to Him. I constantly always
Yes.
want that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And what he is worried about, again, in this sort of rationalist picture, is that the professional theologian, instead of getting on her knees and weeping for her sins, writes treatises or studies other people's better treatises about theology. Or the moralist, rationalist, Kantian talks about moral duty and moral obligation. You should do this and you should not do that. It's like people. Jesus. Okay, look at how he and he talks he talks about risk. At the bottom of 373, without risk there's no faith. It sounds a bit like Pascal. And this next selection I know is kind of annoying in the sense that it sort of runs on, but he actually, I think this has best illustrated the kind of anxiety, or the classic word is angst, he wants people to have in their faith. Behind their faith, he illustrates it by reflecting on Jesus being received in his time. And he's saying in a way, he's also saying to Lessing, okay, fine, you don't live now, you don't live when Origen lived. Try to imagine it, you idiot. We can't deal with the historical problem, but he's trying to suggest in this next selection, 375 on, that if Jesus came back today, doesn't it stand to reason that he would be received in exactly the same way? So we have to have that feeling of risk, that sort of passion for the infinite, that unsettled feeling all the time, okay? So just let me give you a couple of examples in the few minutes we have here, okay? On 375, halfway down on the right-hand side, he said, the form in which he appears is as different as possible from what the majority expect. I mean, isn't this like a central theme, like when we do the Gospel of Luke and Encounter Christ, or whatever you call it, right? You can talk about the Essenes and Second Temple Judaism. You could go back and read, the prophets and see everything's pointing to Jesus. Here he comes. Okay, what is the overall level of satisfaction assessment program of the chosen Messiah? Sorry, that sounded like I meant to. Okay, but it's like, right? Like some of the Jews wanted Maximus, slay the Romans. Woo! He's awesome. Yes, right? I mean, the Essenes maybe wanted another John the Baptist, or I don't know what to make the Essenes exactly, okay? But he says the Gospels are a series of disappointed expectations. And that's what he does in these different sections. So, and he asks us to imagine that we're different groups of people meeting Jesus for the first time. So just for example, if you look at the bottom of 376, we have the sensible person might say, there's a deep insight into the human heart. That's it's really long, that there was the speculation. So that's 376 on the right, 2/3 of the way down. He who by many statements betrays such a deep insight into the human heart, I cannot deny him. He certainly must very well know what I, with less than half of my wisdom, can tell him in advance. So he's alluding to the sort of the rationalist moral teacher Jesus. This Jesus has some really smart things to say. I think I'm going to listen to him, okay? All right. And then 377 on the left, his life is just fantastic. It's ridiculous, okay? And he says, if one judges in that way, one is kind enough to forget completely the sheer madness that he considers himself to be God, okay? He's crazy. It's a ridiculous claim, okay? He's already passed the 30 years of age, and he's literally a nobody. And he claims to be God. He even goes to his hometown, and he gets kicked out of his hometown. Okay? Or 377 on the right. There is something extraordinary about this man. There's really no doubt about it. First, provided one reserves one's right and the right of sound human understanding to refrain from any opinion with respect to his claim to be God. Do you see him mocking the rational, socially acceptable of Jesus? Okay, in this, a couple more instances. 370 at the top, the moral Jesus in the form of, if what this man wants is the good and the true, something I leave undecided, then he's at least doing good so far, especially for the youth and the inexperienced young. So we're giving people the Jesus that the youth need, what would they want to hear? And then there's more. The clergyman on 379 on the left. The clergyman might say, for an impostor and a demagogue, there's really something unusually honest about him. So he's sort of imagining people, different kind of characters receiving Jesus. And he says the clergyman away is closest, 379 at the top. He says the expected one is going to look very different. He will come as the most glorious flowering in the highest unfolding of the established order. But what he's saying there is that if we go too far in reading scripture as a kind of rational argument, this is like the Hegelian critique. Everything is developing according to an exact plan. There's no messiness or randomness in history. There's really no free human agency in mucking things up. He's saying that this is how the expected one will come. Okay, and he'll be a little bit different, but he's not going to muck up this basic authority that God has set in place. Okay, and at the bottom of 379, he's like, what about that stuff about not putting a patch on an old garment? Okay, and we get more. The sagacious statesman, 380. The solid citizen on 381. Everything is good in moderation. Okay, enough of this. Okay. All right, so let's look at the end here. 382, the right-hand side. My friend, I really do know what I'm doing, my responsibility. Imagine yourself contemporary with him. Imagine yourself I wrote of that. Does it say inviter or invitee?
Inviter.
So it's right, so that's referring to him, the inviter. Imagine that you are a sufferer, but bear in mind the risk you are running by becoming his disciple, by following him. You are running the risk of unconditionally losing almost everything. To become a follower of him is the greatest possible lunacy. You might become a lunatic. No, but I mean, do you see sort of the exercise that he's engaged in here, kind of rhetorically? I mean, whether you're talking to have in mind the rationalists or just what we all do. I mean, I want you to see there's a power here to this teaching on discipleship, right? We make Jesus into a moral teacher, we domesticate him, blah blah blah. We talk about not just his moral teaching, but all, the works of mercy, and I don't want to go rehearse all these things that he said. Help me, Lord. But what we forget is that Jesus was a disappointment to everyone. And that's why he was crucified. And it stands to reason that he would piss us off as much if he came now. And Lord knows we would do it all over again. I'm saying that as a provocation, right? But I mean, his point is that as soon as we make Jesus a sort of neat, tidy package, part of this historical development or this neat moral argument, we've made him in a different way, albeit we've made him just into another tiny little object in the cabinet of our own personal piety. He's like, to answer the call of discipleship is terrifying and a risk. It is to be unsafe, perhaps even to be considered a lunatic. What do you think, Justin? I mean, does that have a power to you, or I need to be on the spot?
Okay. Yeah, I'm just still trying to make sense of everything.
Yeah.
I'm not feeling any one thing right now.
Yeah, that radicalness. Jesus really mostly gets people off. You guys want a break? What do you think? What'd you say?
I said, that's crazy.
That's crazy? What do you mean?
No, like to think that like in the way that you're saying it, like Jesus annoyed people, which like I think is hard for us to think about, but like actually true.
What was the icing here?
Like it's actually true. He probably didn't.
Yes. Yeah, and he's saying he's not saying turn around and be annoying. He's saying imagine that you really are the suffering person. Okay, he is kind of annoying, at least rhetorically. We say imagine you're the suffering one, the leper outside of the city wall saying, please, I know you can't have mercy on me. You need to feel desperate. Awesome. Okay. Do you guys have those questions from last time that I asked you to finish for this time? Oh, come on, really?
You said that we finished. You said you were finished.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No, I didn't. Yes, I did. I remember that. Okay. Then can you bring them for the class after the break?
Yeah.
I'll send you an email because I don't expect you to remember that.
Oh, I have a question. When you're writing the words original thing, capital or capital?
It doesn't matter. I mean, I shouldn't say that.
If somebody was writing a paper for you, and they
I would say not. But it depends. I could imagine a context in